Good day, everyone. I'm going to be starting today's event. I want to welcome everyone here. But before we begin, I'd like to invite David Phipps, Assistant Vice President of Research, Strategy and Impact, to provide our land acknowledgement. David?
Great, thank you very much, Sheila. As we are not all gathered in the same space, we recognize that this land acknowledgement might not be for the territory that you are currently on. We ask that if this is the case, you take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory you are on and the current treaty holders. We recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. We acknowledge our presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. York University acknowledges our presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations, and the area known as Tekaronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and the Métis. It is now home to many Indigenous peoples. We acknowledge the current treaty holders and Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant and agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region.
Miigwech, thank you, David, for the land acknowledgement. So Bojo, Kwekwe, Semakwe Dijnakas, Makwado Dem, Kemiagama, Anishinaabe. My name is Sheila Cote-Meek, and I'm the Vice President of Equity, People and Culture here at York University. I'm really pleased to welcome you here to this fall's Insight Speaker Series on decolonization, equity, diversity, and inclusion. The speaker series has been designed to inspire our community members to action, provoke thought and conversation across the York community and beyond about issues related to DEDI. This installment aims to open the dialogue around DEDI data in the Canadian higher education context. The panel will have an opportunity to share stories, lessons learned from their own research and experiences in the field. Before we get started, I do have a couple of housekeeping items before we begin. Closed captioning is available in Zoom. Please use the button at the bottom entitled Live Transcript. Q&A or question and answer in the Zoom, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. Please be respectful in asking questions to the panelists. We will ask that disrespectful participants be removed from the event. The event will be recorded and available on the Insight Speakers website at a later date. I would now like to introduce Dr. Rhonda Lenton, York University's President and Vice Chancellor, to provide opening remarks. Over to you, Rhonda.
Miigwech, Sheila. Good afternoon, everyone. Bonjour, bonjour. It's my great pleasure to be able to welcome you to the President's Advisory Council on Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion's 5th installment of the Insight Speakers Series. Before we begin, I would like to thank all of the members of the Council for your commitment, innovation, and leadership in helping to draft York's decolonization, equity, diversity, and inclusion strategy document. I'd also like to thank you for the remarkable effort that you've demonstrated in encouraging and incorporating very broad feedback from stakeholder individuals, groups, and organizations, as well as the external community. This new milestone marks an important step towards reflecting the lived experiences of our own community and of the communities that we serve. We know that there is still much more work to be done to address systemic inequalities at York and more broadly. This is why initiatives like the Insight Speakers Series are so important for fostering dialogue and critical thinking about DEDI issues, strategies, and planning. And at a time in history when communities across the world are confronting persistent systemic discrimination and political polarization, research studies have proven that a long-term and holistic commitment to DEDI in higher education institutions leads to stronger communities, enhanced cross-cultural competencies, an elevated sense of civic responsibility, higher levels of involvement in community action and volunteer programs, and support for degree aspirations amongst minority groups, and much more. This demonstrates that decolonization, equity, diversity, and inclusion has the power to not only transform individual experiences and outcomes, but is also a requirement for supporting sustainable, multicultural, highly educated, and democratic societies that benefit us all. This is why the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, which are embedded in our university academic plan, have included addressing inequity as one of its foundational themes. In fact, we are already making wonderful progress towards that end. As you may know, York University recently ranked in the world's top 35 in the Times Higher Education Impact Rankings for meeting and addressing the Sustainable Development Goals, with its strongest performance in categories linked to DEDI. For example, gender equality, York ranks #1 in Canada and 21st globally. And so as we explore today's topic of focus, DEDI data and Canadian higher education, I hope we will all take the opportunity to build on these exciting achievements and discover new ways of conceptualizing, identifying, and addressing systemic barriers at our institution and beyond. To our panelists, we are very grateful for your valuable perspectives, experiences, and the talents that you bring to the table, and for your interest in championing DEDI across our communities. So thank you so much. Merci, miigwech.
Miigwech, thank you, Rhonda, for your opening remarks. I am really looking forward to the conversation today around data and disaggregating data in higher ed, and talking just generally about the importance of that, and how we can lead changes going forward around equity and diversity and inclusion, and really focusing in on the importance of why data matters. So I'm not going to say too much. Each of the panelists are going to be doing short opening remarks. They've each been given about 12 minutes each, and then we will have time at the end for questions and answers. And I hope that the audience will engage and ask some of those critical questions around EDI data and the importance of EDI data in Canadian higher education. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce the first panelist that will be speaking, Dr. Carl James, who's been the Senior Advisor on Equity Representation in the Division of Equity, People and Culture now for, I think it's about 3 years. He also is the Jean Augustine Chair in Education, Community and Diaspora, as well as a faculty member in the Faculty of Education here at York University. His research interests include examination of the educational, social, and occupational experiences and opportunities and achievements of Black and other racialized Canadians, noting the ways in which societal and institutional structures mediate their lived realities. I'm proud to say he is the 2022 Killam Laureate for Social Sciences awarded by the Canadian Council for the Arts. Congratulations, Carl. His most recent publication released in October is First Generation Student Experiences in Higher Education, Counter Stories with Leanne Taylor, which was published in the fall of 2022. So welcome, Carl.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sheila, and for inviting me to be part of this panel. Sorry. I spent quite a lot of time thinking, how do I approach this topic of data collection, especially given my interest in data that started many years ago when I started using Toronto District School Board data. And as I thought through what I might have to contribute to the discussion, a number of questions came to me. And so I thought I'd start engaging in this conversation with the questions. And one of the first question after I was invited, I thought, how did we get here? Why are we having conversations about data and why now? And I continue to think here about these questions and why in an institution with many researchers and one with an institution with data is a constant reference because it's understood to be important to informing action. Why sometimes we do not have data even about the population and issues inside the institution. And I think here is how is it that despite claims to be a meritocratic institution in a meritocratic democratic society that passes the message on to us that we provide equal opportunity to members, that data is not employed in order to ensure that this merit and equal opportunity is realized by members of the society. But you might ask me the question, I thought, how do I know that these things are not happening? And my response would be by observations. But I would expect to be challenged further that say, but you need data to be able to go beyond your observations. So indeed, we need to get to data, and we need to have those data inform what we want to do and how we want to go about being and bringing about an equitable society. But I'm well aware of the criticisms about the limits to data and its use. Scholars have asserted that some groups of Canadians, particularly racialized people, data have served to oppress rather than support their equal participation in society. Nevertheless, I want to put forward 3 points in this brief discussion about what I think we might want to consider with regard to data. One of the first points is going to be recognition of inequity in the society, and therefore that inequity is going to be evident in the institutions of that society because inequity is part of the cultural frame of the society. The second point I want to make is to cultivate equity in that institution, we need to have a culture of equity, diversity, a culture of decolonization, equity, diversity, and inclusion. So it cannot be isolated into one area. It has to be a culture. And when I use culture, I'm deliberate in saying how the structure promotes and emphasizes equity. The third point I want to make is establish a willingness to implement changes at the institutional level and not just at the individual. So the structure, policies, and program of that institution should be thought of here. So getting back to the first point, recognition of inequity in society. Yes, there is that whole idea of inequity in the society. That was recognized earlier in the mid-1980s when we had the Employment Equity Act that was established. And it was a new legislation that came into being. And later on, in October 1996, we had further development of the Employment Equity Program. The aim of the equity program is to achieve equality in the workplace so that no person shall be denied employment opportunities or benefits for reasons unrelated to ability, and to correct the conditions of disadvantage in employment experienced by women, Aboriginal peoples, persons with disability, and members of visible minorities. And by giving effect to the principle that employment equity means more than treating persons the same, but also requires special measures and the accommodation of differences. So then, if that's supposed, for me, is a signal that, yes, the society is inequitable, and therefore we need to put in place certain kind of measures, and those measures now have been around, and those measures have been around for 35 years. And we would want to think that practicing employment equity in Canada we should be further ahead, but we're still grappling with it. And therefore, the work that's needed is yet to be realized. So that, for me, is one of the points that I'm making here, is that we need to move on recognizing equity and therefore addressing equity. The second point I want to make is the culture of decolonization, equity and diversity and inclusion in the institution. If that's going to happen, we must recognize the value of data to inform the equity program. So for example, in conducting a census of faculty, staff, and students, questions of race are going to be in that census, and we'd want everyone to identify, and not just racialized or Indigenous people to identify those identity. Everyone should recognize and appreciate the value of these identities. So white just as Black should have identified. And I can say that York has been ahead in that, because not only has that census of faculty have been used in terms of the hiring process at York, it has also been used in terms of promoting and including the programs that we at York are willing to give. And it was interesting too, when we think of York, and I think other institutions could borrow from the affirmative action program at York, despite and the recognition that York had before 2020, because before 2020, York established this committee that would look into why we have so few representation of Indigenous and Black faculty, and York put in place a program to be able to correct that. I think then, so that's a signal for me of moving towards a culture in the institution that would encourage and enable and support that movement. However, cultures change, and we have to work at this culture if we're going to really move the agenda forward in the way we'd want to. The other point that I quickly want to get at is that the institution needs to change, because it should not just be individual programs or individual, we will see that the individual is doing the work that's needed. We need the institutions, policies, structure, and program to be really in concert with the DEDI program that's established, and therefore institutions should be using these data to also inform their work. So in looking at this, I did some research and then looked at, it's not just who are coming in, who are hiring, and fortunately at York now we have started getting data on students, so we're moving along, and we have been collecting data on staff. But we need to think of how the institution as a whole represents its population. A 2019 Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at Universities National Survey Research found, this is 2019. I think Dr. Smith might have even more data to add, or more updated data than I do. But the 2019 suggests that racialized people are significantly underrepresented in senior leadership positions at Canadian universities and are not advancing through the leadership pipeline. While racialized people account for 22% of the general population, 40% of the student body, both undergraduate and graduate, 31% of doctorate holders, and 21% of full-time faculty, they comprise only 8% of senior leaders at Canadian universities in the sample. Similarly, people with disabilities account for 22% of the general population and 22% of the faculty, but only account for about 5% of senior leaders at Canadian universities. This may also be due to reluctance to self-identify and slight differences in how the Canadian Survey on Disability and other self-identification form define disability. People of South Asian descent make up the largest group of senior university leaders who identify as racialized, followed by people of Chinese descent. Every racialized group analyzed is underrepresented in senior leadership. In terms of gender identity, 49% identify as females, 41% as males, 51% identify as males, and less than 5 senior leaders identify as gender fluid or non-binary and transgendered. So I think what's to be done, and I think our discussion today, and I'm not going to answer that question, now we can engage in that discussion further, but it means that we have some work to do in terms of bringing about that culture of decolonization, diversity, equity, and inclusion in our institutions. And paying attention to data would be one of the ways in which we can embark on that journey towards bringing that about. Thanks very much. I look forward to engaging in the questions that we are going to provide shortly. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Carl, for those opening remarks, and great question to start us off is, around how are we still here talking about data, and also the 3 kind of areas that you talked about, the piece about recognizing that inequities do exist in society is kind of the first stepping stone to kind of unpacking why those inequities exist, but certainly creating a culture around decolonization and equity, institutional is important, as well as looking beyond the individual and looking at institutional level changes. So I look forward to further comments and discussion around those 3 items, Carl. So I'm going to introduce the second panelist. It is now my real pleasure to introduce the second panelist, Dr. Jan Hare, an Anishinaabe scholar and educator from Chaging First Nation, located in Northern Ontario. She is the professor and D. Pro Tem in the Faculty of Education at the University of British Columbia. In addition, she holds a Canada Research Chair, Tier 1 in Indigenous Pedagogy. Her research is concerned with transforming educational institutions from early childhood, K-12 schooling through to post-secondary education by centering Indigenous knowledges and pedagogies in teaching and learning. This work has led to the development of the massive open line on course, the MOOC Reconciliation Through Indigenous Education, which has been taken by over 70,000 people worldwide. Her current research explores the instructional practices of post-secondary educators, incorporating Indigenous knowledges and perspectives into higher ed classrooms through collaborative inquiry. In addition, she is engaged in theorizing Indigenous-led teacher education programs, narrating their own story bundles. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Hare. Over to you, Jen.
Oh, miigwech. So Bojo, Ani, I'm so pleased to join this important discussion that addresses decolonization, equity, diversity, inclusion, and the work we do in post-secondary institutions. And so miigwech, thank you to Sheila and those organizing the Insight series for this invitation. I'm also pleased to be able to share some of the BC and UBC context, and we'll focus perhaps on decolonizing, the decolonizing of data, recognizing that our policy landscapes between provinces and institutions may differ. So it is a significant topic as post-secondary institutions attempt to utilize data as it concerns students and even faculty and staff as part of their planning, reporting, and policy and decision-making to create more inclusive campus experiences for Indigenous people and those from equity-seeking groups. As post-secondary institutions seek to identify gaps and barriers with the goal towards creating equitable and inclusive working and learning environments, post-secondary institutions are not only collecting data, but making efforts to disaggregate that data. That is breaking it down into subcategories to reveal deprivations and inequalities that may not be fully reflected in aggregated data gathered. So, for example, in British Columbia, new legislation from the BC Office of Human Rights, from the Commission, that seeks to collect disaggregated demographic data with the goals to address systemic racism. And this comes from the Grandmother Perspective Report, which was published in September 2020, which recommends collecting data in the service of systemic inequality with meaningful involvement of equity deserving and underrepresented communities. And in the chat, I'm going to just put a link to this report as it speaks to segregated data. So sorry, I'm just going to put this in.
Jen, while you're taking a moment, also, could you just slow down just a tad?
Sure.
Okay.
We only have 12 minutes.
I know, and I'm so guilty of it too, but.
No worries. So for Indigenous people in higher education, gathering data can be concerning, as Palawa scholar Maggie Walters points out in her scholarship on data politics and Indigenous representation. The racialized reality of data is perpetuated through what she calls the 5 Ds, where data is only useful when considered in relationship or in relation to disparity, deprivation, disadvantage, dysfunction, and difference, which only serve to homogenize, pathologize, demonize, and exoticize Indigenous people, fostering exclusionary practices in education. There is certainly a long history of deficit-framed Indigenous data that governments and institutions, including higher education, have used to define, regulate, and make decisions about Indigenous lives, and that fails to serve Indigenous social and cultural interests. Further, Indigenous data risks being overlooked altogether in academia, says Quechan scholar Jameson Lopez, due to the challenges of gathering data and its statistical limitations. Yet, post-secondary institutions need data relevant to Indigenous people to ensure Indigenous access and attainment, as well as grow and support the Indigenous workforce of faculty and staff. As this panel considers decolonization, equity, diversity, and inclusion, I want to take a moment to distinguish Indigenous priorities from that of equity, diversity goals, and even frameworks being established across institutions. I recognize that there is considerable variation in how post-secondary institutions define, understand, and take up DEDI, and in a range of different strategies. And I think we are seeing how EDI has become a significant policy priority, leading to important strategic activities aimed at positions, practices, programs, and institutional climate. In their analysis of 50 strategic plan documents across the Canadian U15 universities, scholar Merle Tamtik and Melissa Güntner describe how the majority of universities define equity as inclusion, focusing on removing institutional barriers to equal access to education. Fewer universities have taken a more radical approach, viewing equity as fairness that requires a redistribution of resources. The most profound examples of this approach, they indicate, is seen in the creation of diversity admissions policies for equity-seeking student groups, preferential hiring approaches for administration and faculty, and funding designated to equity-seeking groups for both students and faculty. Indigenous and settler scholars Bunda Zippin and Brennan caution against approaches that target Indigenous people as an equity group, given many universities now have recruitment strategies in place for students, staff, and faculty as part of removing institutional barriers to achieving equity. Gori woman scholar Tracy Bunda argues that policies that target Indigenous people, and I quote here, swallow Indigenous identities in the fetish of statistics, objectifying through numbers. ignoring the unique histories and political differences of Indigenous people in relationship to other equity-seeking groups. Quote, to disappear into merely another marker of diversity in an engulfing institution, says Bunda, Zippin, and Brannon, it fails to recognize the distinctive sovereignty of Indigenous people, or how Indigenous viewpoints on the mainstream institution distinctively challenge normative white stream operations. Therefore, I'm suggesting we need to consider Indigenous perspectives that speak to, as well as offer alternatives to the logics and practices of EDI that may not account for Indigenous people's histories, realities, and priorities. Post-secondary institutions developing definitions and standards for collecting student or employment data, as well as establishing data governance, need to consider unique considerations to how Indigenous data are managed. And this can occur through establishing Indigenous stewardship processes and practices. One such approach draws on the OCAP principles of ownership, control, access, and protection established by the First Nations Information Governance Center. And here again, I'm going to put into the chat so people can have a look at these principles. So ownership refers to ownership refers to the relationship of First Nations to their cultural knowledge, data, and information. A community or group owns information collectively in the same way that an individual owns his or her personal information. Control affirms that First Nations, their communities, and representative bodies are within their rights to seek control over all aspects of research and information management processes that impact them. Access refers to the fact that First Nations must have access to information and data about themselves and their communities, regardless of where it is held. The principle also refers to the right to make decisions regarding access to their collective information, and this is achieved through standardized and formalized protocols. And finally, possession is more concrete. It refers to physical control of data and is a mechanism by which ownership can be asserted and protected. So OCAP is a framework at the forefront of Indigenous research and data practices. However, Indigenous data in settler post-secondary institutions is much more complex to manage, given this data is intertwined with Western colonial era statistical methodologies, and nor is data collected with strategies specific to improving outcomes for Indigenous people. Indigenous scholars, among others, call for the decolonizing of Indigenous data. Carroll, Rodriguez-Lombert, and Martinez describe decolonizing data as replacing external or non-Indigenous norms and priorities with Indigenous systems that define data and inform how they are collected and used. And certainly there are other broader frameworks that are being established on a global and regional scale. To address Indigenous data priorities in post-secondary institutions, Australian scholars Wilkes, Kennedy, Drew, and Wilson propose a decolonized data quality framework that suggests 3 considerations for moving forward. The first is that higher education contexts must recognize the importance of Indigenous terms of reference in relation to Indigenous data, including the emergent aspirations and principles of data sovereignty. Indigenous data sovereignty represents a new agenda and direction for the decolonization of data and information practices. In fact, Leon, in his graduate work, and others describe data sovereignty as fundamental to decolonization, acting as resistance to colonial structures of information, and whereby Indigenous people exercise control, access, analysis, interpretation, management, dissemination, and reuse of data through a rights-based approach that includes the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. There are certainly a number of mechanisms in which Indigenous people are exercising Indigenous data sovereignty in higher education, including principles for data governance and management, research protocols, review boards, data sharing agreements, and data repositories. Wilkes and colleagues also advise that in higher education, another consideration to decolonization of data and statistics is for Indigenous people to identify priorities and measures against which data can be collected, analyzed, and ultimately used by institutions and Indigenous people. And here, I just want to briefly share a student demographic project taking place here at UBC that seeks to enhance the collection of student demographic data that will enable the university to better understand student experiences, support student inclusion and success, and assess progress of equity, diversity, and inclusion priorities. This is to ensure evidence-based decision-making. In order to develop demographic questions concerned with affordability, religion, race and ethnicity, gender and disability, focus groups were held with students to understand how students engage with these questions, and then understand how they engage with these questions and understand the questions with the goal towards refining them. And one of the questions pertain to Indigenous self-identification is undergoing a broader set of consultations to include Indigenous leadership in the institution. The project is also guided by a set of principles, including EDI and human rights, as well as Indigenous data stewardship. In addition, the project uses a framework of the 4 Rs: respect, reciprocity, relevance, and responsibility, developed by Indigenous scholars Kirkness and Barnhart to analyze and interpret student input. And here I'm just going to add to the chat as I'm just finishing up here. I'll add to the chat a little bit about this project. So using a slightly different process, the project engages with Indigenous knowledge representation of the 4 Rs and identifying criteria and principles for how Indigenous people themselves choose to identify. And this is important given that Indigenous self-identification varies across time, location, and context, and the dynamics of students' self-identification behaviors will impact on the data. Finally, Wilkes and colleagues recommend developing processes to ensure cultural appropriateness, community responsiveness, quality, and equity in data collection practices in higher education. And here they provide a really good set of practice principles that aim to improve higher education data collection, storage and usage practices, as well as contribute to overall goals of better outcomes for Indigenous students, staff, and faculty. And some of these include recognizing sovereign rights, fostering Indigenous leadership, Indigenous involvement in analysis, measurement, and decision-making, cultural appropriate data collection, and developing protocols. I'm mindful of my time, so I'll just stop there. So, miigwech.
Miigwech, Jan, for sharing that information, certainly highlighting some of the problems and challenges with collection of data, self-identification data, and in particular, racialized data. I will have to make note of that article that talked about the 5 Ds, because it seemed to really summarize some of the real problems that, you know, on the negative side around data collection, around disparity, disadvantage, dysfunction, and difference. I think I forgot the 5th one, but certainly also highlighting, you know, the need for data to understand, you know, the bodies, you know, of people that we're working with, and how to support and grow, say, for example, the work of equity across the institution. And another important piece, I think, that I'd like to come back to is around this whole notion around the swallowing up of, if you will, of Indigenous identity within kind of these larger data sets. And then Indigenous identity then gets lost or just generally just disappears. And certainly the pieces around ownership, control, access, and possession are critical in terms of Indigenous data sovereignty. So thanks. I don't think I covered everything. Like, I just tried to pick some highlights of your talk, but thanks so much for sharing your thoughts around DEDI. So I would now like to introduce our third and final panelist, Dr. Malinda Smith, Vice Provost and Associate Vice President Research at the University of Calgary. Dr. Smith is the author and editor of 7 books. She is co-author of the well-known publication, The Equity Myth, Racialization and Indigeneity at Canadian Universities, that was published in 2017. Co-editor of Critical Concepts, An Introduction to Politics. That's out this year in 2023. Nuances of Blackness in the Canadian Academy, 2022. And States of Race, Critical Race Feminists for 21st Century, 2010. Also the editor of 3 books on Africa, including Securing Africa, Post 9/11, Discourses on Terrorism, 2010. She serves on many national bodies, including the External EDI Advisory Board, Innovation, Science and Economic Development, Governor for the Shirt Council and Executive Member of Stats Canada's Immigration and Ethnocultural Advisory Committee, and member of the Scarborough Charter Interinstitutional Advisory Committee. So it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Smith here to the panel. Over to you, Malinda.
Thank you very much, Sheila. It's a privilege to be a part of this panel. It couldn't be more timely in this environment. Before I offer a few remarks, I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I am speaking to you from the University of Calgary, which is located on the traditional territories, I want to slow down, of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, and that the city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. Thank you to President Lenton, to you, Sheila, and to David Phipps for the introduction, and to all the staff who have and made our participation possible. I think this panel invites us to think about what we mean by EDI data. The acronym EDI, Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, is relatively new in the Canadian higher education landscape, although people think it's older. And Carl James in his talk highlighted earlier nomenclatures like affirmative action, but there's also employment equity. And I think there's DEID now, but also, as you know, there's the Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Decolonization Report, 2021 from the Federation for Humanities and Social Sciences. So a lot of acronyms, which really requires us to think about the language of EDID and what we mean by it, and what does the second D, whether we mean decolonization or disaggregated, what that acronym means. So I think we often in everyday conversation too readily passes over these things, but I think that's those genealogies of these concepts and what they do matter. And so I want to say my comments are shaped by over 25, 30 years of experience in post-secondary education in Canada, and participation on various national groups, including for faculty like COUT, Racialized and Academic Staff Working Group, and EDI and EDI Council, as well as various Stats Canada's Working Group on Black Population in Canada, and advisory groups in EDI in the research ecosystem. And it's now shaped by my experience as being an EDI in management or as an academic administration university. I highlight this because I think we've been dealing with EDI data, what we call EDI data now, for over 30 years. And and many of the conversations we are having now, we were having in the mid-1980s. So it does beg the question, why are we still having these conversations now? And what difference will this conversation make going forward? So at University of Calgary, I've had the privilege of participating in the launch of an EDI. University of Calgary had a EDI policy since 1989. I was at the University of Alberta. We had it since also since the late 80s and 90s. And so this is not a new conversation, including collecting disaggregated data and collecting self-ID data. So the question for me in 2022 is, what lessons have we learned? So at University of Calgary, we made a commitment to EDI data transparency. So we have a dashboard where all the data that we have, we put in the dashboard. We have launched an EDI data hub with infographics of the internal data, but also the comparative data in Canadian post-secondary sector through Stats Canada, but also internationally. And if many of you know, we recently launched an Inclusive Excellence Cluster Hiring Initiative for hiring 45 members from equity deserving groups. And there was an EDI data report with our 2021 data included with that, which highlights the gaps, not just at the aggregate level of the university, but also by faculty and by each equity deserving group. So this signals a commitment to a robust EDI data collection, but we collect data since the 1980s. Do we analyze the data? And when we analyze the data, why are we analyzing the data? Are we monitoring the trends? Are we developing policies and procedures to close the gaps we have identified for each group? And if we're not doing that, I think that's why it leads to cynicism. So we've also launched an expanded employment equity census, a student equity census. And in each of these, we've had to think about postdocs and also contract staff. So what I want to highlight then is the gaps, the variation in data across Canada. Most institutions have administrative data for gender binary, and they are updating that with non-binary. Many have Indigenous data. And then there's a question around data sovereignty, who controls it? At University of Calgary, I'm the EDI data steward. My colleague, Dr. Michael Hare, is the Indigenous data steward. And so we have conversations about stewardship of that data and what does the data do and who interprets it. This is important. But let me also stress that we have been doing this work in Canada in the post-secondary sector since the 1980s, the Royal Commission on Equality and Employment. And I want to stress what Abella said then. The success of an employment equity program is measured by results. Expansion of the employment opportunities of qualified members of the designated groups. Well, you cannot measure the expansion without data. And you cannot measure the expansion if we have data only for one equity group, women, but not for other equity groups that are comparable. So I don't think most institutions have employment equity initiatives. I think they have gender equity initiatives. And we need to be clear about that. That's inequity among equity groups as shaped by the data. So we need a more robust, inclusive data set. And I want to stress again that in 1984, when Abella launched the committee, the Royal Commission report, what she said was they didn't have data for persons with disabilities. That's still true for most institutions 30-something years later. She said we needed statistical indicators of possible systemic discrimination for each group, 1984. Participation rate for each group, unemployment rates, income levels. So pay equity, not just gender pay equity, but pay equity for racialized people, for Indigenous peoples, for persons with disabilities. And we need to figure out occupational segregation. Were members of these groups located in specific kinds of positions within the institution? So that's why the census collects this data. And I'm pleased to see that in 2021, the census has released this data as disaggregated. So not just Indigenous, but First Nation, Métis, and Inuit, and not just racialized or visible racialized minorities, but also for Black, South Asian, East Asian, Filipino, Chinese, West Asian, East Asian, Arab, and so on. So I want to just connect 1984 to 22 as important. The second thing that I think is important to highlight, so we need disaggregated data collection. We need quantitative data. Yes, to the critics, representation does matter. However, it's the floor, not the ceiling. And we cannot alleviate tokenism without critical mass. We cannot have robust curriculum innovations, Black studies, Indigenous studies, without representation. Research breadth, EDI in the research ecosystem, Canada Research Chairs, Canada Excellence Research Chairs, CRC program, Dimensions EDI, all require robust disaggregated data. We need epistemic pluralism and cognitive justice, all require a critical mass of people, members of each equity deserving group. Without data, we cannot understand this. We need qualitative data to understand experiences. So not just do we have the people on campus, does the professoriate reflect the diversity of the student body or the broader population? We actually need to understand the experiences of people, what pushes them out, what welcomes them, what kind of environment that's created. So beyond the EDI quantitative data, we also need student, postdoc, and contract. This is relatively new. This is not employment equity. This is what EDI, Indigenous engagement, does. It adds this pipeline, which exists for women. It extends it now to members of each of the equity deserving group. And I will just say Indigenous peoples as well. Building on dimensions, equity, diversity, inclusion, we also need to understand storytelling, the voices of members of equity deserving groups. And this, I think, speaks to something around that I'm hesitant about using decolonization in this context, but it does speak to the principle about nothing about us without us. Or put differently, everything, nothing without us, to shorten that principle. So this correlates with who is the data for, who owns the data sovereignty questions, how is it used, and to what ends. And my view here is that the data collection in and of itself is not equity data. How that data is mobilized to transform conditions in the academy helps to facilitate it, whether it's equity data. So to return to Bella, what was very clear was what she said was, and I think this is important today, we need a broad approach that's necessary. This is 1984, this is 2022. The employment practices cannot be assessed fairly in a cultural vacuum. In other words, we need to understand the context in which we are doing this work. And she said the political, economic, and social, the broader society, because the university is a microcosm of the society. Practices must be placed in context. It must be multidimensional. So not just the data, as Carl James and John Hare have highlighted, but also, and not just the barriers each of the equity deserving groups face, but how do we avoid a distorted perspective? So University of Calgary, we also say one size does not fit all. And I hope this actually speaks to the concerns that Sheila Cote-Meek raised around whether Indigenous becomes lost in translation among equity deserving groups. Black scholars also raise these kinds of concerns. And of course, the concept, nothing about us without us, emerged in the context of critical disability studies. So disability studies scholars raise these concerns. Every equity group is concerned about being lost in a homogeneous group. So not one size fits all, which then requires us to have a clear mapping of the pathways for each equity deserving group. And we will see that those pathways may not look the same, but without data, quantitative, qualitative, storytelling, as we borrow from dimensions, we won't be able to understand these pathways for each group. We will be developing one size fits all approaches. And I think that's actually does violence to this work. So she recommended that we actually need to be paying attention to societal factors. At the time of the report, there was only data on women. In many institutions, that remained the case. We should not, even as we try to push the boundaries, we should not lose sight that many Canadian universities, colleges, and CEGEPs still aren't collecting data. And we are a billions of dollars post-secondary sector, research-intensive institutions, world-leading institutions, and we cannot assemble leaders to put together a national census that universities can use in order to collect comparative data. So I'm pleased to say that Stats Canada and Dimensions EDI are leading on this with the UCAS modernization initiative. We should not lose sight of that. And that I fully anticipate that the Employment Equity Task Force Review Panel, led by law professor at McGill, Del Blackett, would lead to innovations in the the Employment Equity Act, but also the vocabulary reuse and the role of Indigenous within that, but also lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer. And secondly, that StatsCan-led UCAS modernization will mean we go from the UCAS just being about women and age to us for thinking about how we have administrative data for each equity deserving group. So in the 1980s, there was consultation with each group was an integral part of the decision making, and that's a quote. And it's clear that the involvement is necessary in the design and delivery of programs intended for those who benefit. Nothing about us without us for each equity deserving group. Believe government intervention is necessary. If we wait and hope, it's not going to happen. We have seen that. Traditional anti-discrimination focus on individual cases of intentional discrimination is inadequate. We need data to highlight that. The focus in the past, as it should be today, is on systemic discrimination. So we can spend a lot of time talking about the academic pipeline, student experience, staff experience, because staff often get left out. We could talk about movement through the ranks, assistant, associate, full professors. We could talk about completion rate, push out rates. All of them require a sophisticated data infrastructure. And the last point I would make about this is not just data infrastructure, it requires data analysts and it requires IT specialists. And these are two of the areas we often see under-supported institution, because people can be statisticians, but they may not understand equity data. They may not understand principles like OCAP or Indigenous data sovereignty. So this is why a robust team of data collection, analysts, widespread discussions with communities are essential for next generation EDI data approach in universities. Let me end with this conversation about the vocabulary reuse, the second D as in decolonization. I mean, in the final report of the for the Federation for Humanities and Social Sciences, launched on 8th of March, 2021, we said that we use EDID, and I know that York is hosting the next Congress, and this kind of question of decolonization will be an indispensable part of that. That second D, I'm concerned, is become just an acronym and risks what Eve and Yang talk about in terms of it's a metaphor. Decolonization in that second D in our report for the Federation, Igniting Change, highlights the genealogy of decolonizations, the role of universities, whether we think of what Toronto Metropolitan University did, McGill did, Ryerson, Lord Dalhousie did, the discussions around names, all of these symbols, decolonization of curriculum, epistemic pluralism, all of these things I think matter. I think they are somewhat substantively different and genealogically different from the data pieces, but connected. So I think this idea of diversity, I mean, decolonization, not diversity, is a false binary. And I hope that our conversation today will help us to understand those relationships of those terms, but also the tensions, we should name it, that's emerging between EDI and Indigenous engagement, because it invites us to understand fundamentally the ontological, but also the human rights and dignity questions that matter. It's not just about data, but it's also about relationships, and it's also about good relations. And the question is, how do we move forward in our institutions with advancing these agendas, connected to data, but not exclusively to data, in order to create a more equitable, diverse, accessible, and inclusive university. And those terms don't all mean the same thing, but also one that's more decolonized. And I think that's a project, those are related, if separate projects, but they are not either or. And I'd like for us to think about those in our conversations. Thank you.
Miigwech, thank you, Malinda, for that. And you started off talking about the language of DEDI and why language matters. And actually, you came full circle and ended with kind of a key point around understanding that and unpacking what we're actually meaning around decolonization, what we mean about equity, decolonization, diversity, inclusion, accessibility, and so forth. And it's really, important. I wholeheartedly agree with that. So thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today and talking about, the importance of data, but also thinking through some of the critical questions that we need to ask around, nothing about us without us. And who's the data for, who owns the data, critical questions, and how it's used. And we really do need to understand kind of the culture and the context of the work that we're doing if we're going to use kind of this point in time, if you will, to facilitate change. I certainly appreciate, the comment that all the panelists made about, the Employment Equity Act has been around for what, 30 or 40 years now. I think it's 40 years, really. And we knew back then that employment equity wouldn't happen unless we make it happen. But yet here we are still in 2022 talking about how to make it happen and how do we drive forward around creating more equitable, inclusive, and accessible societies for everyone. So I know that there's some questions coming in from the audience, and we will turn to those as well. So I will ask all the panelists to please turn on their camera and microphone. We're going to go to some of the questions now, and please feel free to ask questions. I see a couple of them there now. And I will try to get through some of them. So the first question is directed to Carl from one of the participants. When Carl said that equity deserving groups are underrepresented, is the comparator group to the self-disclosed group the student body, the surrounding community, or Canada? So I guess the Mark, you're asking about who's the comparative group that's the, that we're measuring against this underrepresentation. Carl?
I would say all of the above. I'm thinking here, when I think of that, and when we think of it largely, we think about, well, how do these what are these group numbers in the society? And are they to be found in university in the same number? And how are they going to be found in university as students, as faculty members, as staff, etc.? But I also think that it's not just simply them being found in university, because even in universities, when we think of the numbers, we look at how they are racially represented among the faculty and so forth. So we're constantly making those comparisons, yes, and which is the comparative group, whether it's a society, but increasingly as we go, some racialized group and Indigenous students, in particular, we know that they're not as represented as we would have expected them to be.
Thanks, Carl, for that response. I'll move to a question from Anne Stebbins. Oh, sorry. Just looking for the question again, sorry. Could the three scholars each speak to what their university is doing to use data to be able to identify and then admit more equity deserving applicants? So maybe I'll go to Jan for this question, and then Malinda, and then I'll come back to Carl.
Okay, sorry, to admit equity deserving applicants in terms of students, students at grad, undergrad, or perhaps we're also talking employees as well in terms of, so UBC, I think, uses, I'm just going to talk about a couple of the surveys that UBC uses. So one is around equity as an equity employment survey. So, looking to try and look at patterns and trends in employment across the university. It's something that they do every 5 years to gather this information and inviting, and it's an invitation for people to complete the survey. And I think this is creates some challenges because we don't have, I'm just going to use our faculty as an example, where we don't have a high completion rate in the survey. So it's really hard to determine, where are the gaps? Where do we need to reduce barriers for those from equity seeking groups for opportunities in creating employment. And I'm going to say it's similarly the same with our student survey and student experience survey. And so I think we need to look at ways in which to engage our communities then in completing and taking part in surveys. I know for many of our Indigenous faculty, Indigenous students, this is not, survey practices are not something that are fully engaged in, given the history of how data has been used, and I'm going to against actually aspirations and goals for Indigenous people.
Thanks, Jen, for that. Malinda, did you want to comment on the question as well?
So the
Can I
admissions,
read the question again?
pardon me?
Did you want me to read the question again?
Sure. I mean, I think it's about admissions.
Yeah, it's around admission.
So I think this is why I say, so what's the purpose of equity data? And it actually, this question relates to the one that Carl answered previously about the comparative data. And so part of what we want to understand is the diversity of the population, diversity of particular age groups who are moving into the academy, and whether we are missing any group disproportionately. So we need to know the city, the provincial, but also the national data for students. And also staff, as John said, and then since professors are recruited from across the country and the world, we need that kind of data. So yes, we have self-ID student data, and the response rates are low. I actually think this is also a function of technology, and they are not actually. We don't have an equity act for students, postdocs, or contract. So we need to figure out the Employment Equity Act is not sufficient in itself for this question. That said, Stats Canada data does show that there are high levels of members of equity deserving groups. So you say Chinese and some Asians, Filipino, Black, who have high levels of completion rates for school. And the question is, what happens to the pipeline into colleges, universities, and CGEPs? That's one question. And then, are they fairly evaluated? So at University of Calgary, we have, say, for the Black Law and Medicine admissions program, we have a diversity admissions program, we have various kinds of admissions programs. And I think what's needed, though, is a more university-wide initiative besides specific faculties, but where people are evaluating the criteria for any admissions program. You see, law schools got rid of the LSAT, and whether they fairly reflect the ability of people to succeed within those programs. And to John's point, yes, we also have our Inclusive Excellence Cluster Hiring Initiative for 45 scholars, but that's just to ask, to me, these are steps. What's necessary is whether do they actually close the gap? And that's where the data analysis comes in. The questions about students is, do they stay? Do we retain them, or do they get pushed out? And that's where we need data on completion rates and so on. So yes, University of Calgary has this, has some admissions for members of equity deserving groups. Whether it's for all equity deserving groups, I would say no. And that's why we need a much more comprehensive equity admissions policy.
Thanks for that, Malinda. And I think too, when we think about data like that, we also have to your earlier point around, collecting qualitative data and putting the story around the quantitative data, have to understand why, for instance, people might leave or get pushed out, to use your words, out of a system, whether they're students, staff, and or faculty. So thanks for those comments.
And
Carl.
sorry. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Jen, and then I'll go. Carl.
I really appreciate Emily's point. And I think, we have, when I think about some of how our data is collected in the admissions process, our admissions focuses on who's accepted. So we really get a sense of who's accepted. We don't get a sense of who's not accepted. And that's really problematic because we don't know who then is turned away. So we have an understanding of the patterns of the characteristics in that of our applicants only through who's accepted. And so by not being able to understand who's not accepted, I think that poses challenges in the process of bringing equity to the process. But also I think we do, alongside of that in these applications, we don't allow for this storytelling narrative. And really appreciated Malinda's point about bringing storytelling into the process of not just understanding the data, but I think processes that contribute to, reducing recruitment and retention of our students.
Thanks, Jen. Certainly makes sense as well that we do need to understand who isn't accepted. We often don't ask that question, right? So that's an important piece. Carl, any comments around self-identification and admissions relative to students?
I agree. I keep thinking who chooses to self-identify is also important because in some places, in some people's sense, they might think that self-identification is not something that they want to engage in because they do not want to be part of that process. On the other hand, they're also racialized and others and Indigenous, I'm sure, who would not self-identify because they're never quite sure how's the university going to use that information. So these become ways in which if we're doing a whole EDI, we have to develop a culture where we send the message out that this information that you're giving to us as identity are going to be used in particular ways in the equitable way that we're talking about here today. And so I think it's important. So I agree with what Jan and Malinda have said in terms of the qualitative and the quantitative data must also come together in order to help us further our work.
Yes, and that kind of leads to the kind of next question that's come up in the Q&A, and that is actually around, how do we deal with sensitive data? For example, people with hidden disabilities, for example, who choose not to self-identify or come out on a survey, and other kinds of contested definitions of Indigenous, for example, Métis. Any advice from the panelists around that? Malinda, go ahead.
This is really important. We have noticed a shift at University of Calgary from the old employment equity census to our new expanded employment equity census in 2021, where we allowed people to select, we disaggregated different types of disabilities. So we had questions about whether the definition, right, because around impairment and things that seem to may suggest medicalized model. So what we noticed is the increase in self-ID with the options for disaggregated. And the three that came up most frequently were chronic illness, mental health, and neurodiversity. Whereas I think earlier we were thinking mostly of physical disabilities. So that was one thing. And the question we had was, why is there's such a dramatic increase, which suggested not in the representation, but under self-ID people reporting. We knew there were more people with disabilities because they would apply for benefits, accommodations. So the accommodations data was different from the self-ID data. Because people feel like stigma would lead to them having disadvantages. And the only way the university can deal with that is to increase literacy, but also to demonstrate by action that this is to enable people to flourish by self-IDing. So we saw that invisible or hidden disabilities, the numbers went up with the different survey, but also with some literacy. I think we have a long ways to go on accessibility, on disability accessibility and accommodations at universities. But so I'll stop there and let others enter. And we have differences for students versus staff and faculty. I think we do better for students. I don't know that we do well for staff. We go some ways for faculty.
Thanks for those comments, Malinda. Anyone else want to add any further comments? I'll move on to it's kind of almost along the same lines, talking again about admissions data. Would you consider to surveying staff who has to administer the admissions? So for example, any thoughts about engaging non-academic staff in the undergrad and graduate programs? So I think what the question is getting at is, would we consider surveying staff who are actually administering the questions about how we, might engage staff as well as students, I suppose, in the self-identification process? Carl, I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, I'm not sure, but I'm thinking here that of course, staff, and as we've said here already, staff really need to be engaged, and we need to know about staff. Sometimes I think they're left off of the discussion in the ways that we'd want them to. But it's important, therefore, to constantly see that staff are very much part of that representation of the EDI program. And that's why I talked about, though, if there's a culture of equity, therefore everyone within that institution is going to be engaged and has to be engaged in that process.
Right. Okay, Malinda, go ahead.
I was just going to add one comment. Some universities have this diversity admissions, or where they ask people to write a short essay or some kind of narrative about their experiences that invites them to be considered for this kind of admissions. And that's led to a lot of pushbacks about, one, are you asking people to expose very sensitive information about themselves to be a part of the institution? But the other part of it is, are the people who are evaluating it qualified to be reading this information? And what are they going to do about it? Like what metrics, what basis are they making these decisions about yay or nay on by people sharing their experiences of hardships in order to be admitted? So I think that's led to some reservations about those kinds of admissions programs, rather than say some STEM disciplines where they're evaluating, well, do you actually need chemistry? Or do you actually need a particular, or can we provide that in another way? So like the transition year programs. So that question about the staff and how they feel about this is a really good one, and I appreciate it.
Could I add to that?
Go ahead, Carl.
Quickly, because what we're saying is that everyone has to recognize they bring a lived experience to the reading of these things, and if they do not recognize how that reading that they're bringing to it might not be in equitable process, then it's not going to work in the way that we're wanting it to work. So we have to recognize the experience we bring in order to be able to move towards the equity that we see.
Thanks.
And and I think from my own experience, I think about the work that needs to be done in educating those who are part of admissions and who work in admissions committee, and educating around issues of EDI, around decolonization. I think that's something we've really been trying to do and to work with, and also really interested in what would it mean? I'm just kind of putting this out there as to, I mean, one, also changing our policies. I just think there are some admissions policies that need to be changed that might better support and support the work of our those assisting with admissions, but also interested in the use of rubrics and how people then are using rubrics, EDI rubrics within admissions, and how that then is perhaps having an impact in diversifying our admissions.
Thanks, Jan, for that. I wouldn't mind hearing a little bit more about what you mean by rubrics relative to EDI data. Are you thinking it's getting more at the pieces around intersectionality of identities?
Maybe not so much. Well, I think that could certainly be one part of it. But if we look at when we look at programs, and I'm just going to give, teacher education is one example where you have just such an enormous amount of applications. And, we're seeing different kinds of processes for admissions. And I think changing processes for admissions is important, whereby, people are doing these and I'm seeing it in medical school as well, where they're doing these, short interviews, and the interviews then allow people to better assess, I think, the unique contributions, I think, that students will then bring to these programs. So I think some of it's changing the process, but I guess I am thinking about kinds of rubrics that help us assess and work towards equity, diversity, inclusion, and decolonization. And what would those rubrics then look like? So, I'm sort of turning it to others here on the panel, if they are familiar then with other kinds of processes that perhaps take up rubrics or other forms of experiences in the admissions.
Any other comments from the panelists? I'll go to the next question then, which is actually around intersectional identities. And I guess the question is around how are your universities responding to candidates' intersectional social identities, through self-identification forms, or how is that addressed or taken up at your university? Maybe I'll start with Malinda, then I'll go back to Jan and then to Carl.
So this is a very important question. And since we are talking about data panel, one of the things I will just start by saying is it asked a question about, I think, is it Jan who asked this about students mostly, but I think it's relevant to faculty and staff. Do we have applicant data? Is that applicant data, applicant self-ID data? Does the applicant self-ID data allow for disaggregated identities? And can you do an intersectional analysis? So one, it requires the applicant survey to have this aggregation. Two, it requires somebody to analyze the data and talk about intersection. And three, it requires them to provide. So don't forget the data analysts, because one of the things I'm hinting at is universities have inadequate numbers of data analysts. And then do they provide it to the committee to use that as part of their decision making for shortlisting? I'm not persuaded we have that movement from applicant to analysis to shortlisting. And I would say there's a discussion about it, but I still think we are still dealing with silos. I mean, many are still moving from just the aggregated data, the 4 groups, to let alone disaggregated data, let alone intersections. Another comment, unless you are collecting disaggregated data, it is virtually impossible to highlight the intersections. And so if you only have gender data or gender binary data, there's no way to think about people with multiple and intersecting identities. So it's a question that remains a question about whether in fact we have actually had that kind of data collection. And I did have one question around attestation. This came up, how do you attest that people say they're Black? You have to have either put a letter of application, sign an attestation form, where if they sign this form that they are Black or South Asian or Arab or Chinese, Métis or Inuit, they have a disability, and if they lie, that's fraud, identity fraud. We know, and John probably could speak more to this, that Indigenous people are saying attestation may not be ideal, or self-ID is certainly not enough. There needs to be something more. And what that more is, you have to be in consultation with Indigenous colleagues and leaders to define that process. And that is sensitive, because you need the nuanced analysis of that committee to think through what they receive. And no generic committee alone without Indigenous leadership can do that work. So that's a easy sounding question in one sense, but very difficult in another sense.
Thanks, Malinda. Jan, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, just in terms of, how complex self-identification data is. And I agree with Malinda, that's to the importance of disaggregating the data to be able to understand those intersectionalities. And I think part of the work in the student data project that I shared, the link to it, one of the sort of approaches has been to use a holistic, what they're calling a holistic person approach, and recognizing that, someone can have more than one affiliation at a time, even recognizing that even that can then be fluid. So I think, again, looking at our approaches to how we are gathering the data is important.
Thanks, Jan. And last word to Carl, because I am cognizant of time. Thank you.
I think there's no question that there's not just one identity. It's going to constantly be intersectional. And therefore, we're going to have to develop ways in which we have done that. At York, sometimes when we're doing the hiring and we're doing AA hiring, we pay attention to that intersection. But of course, it doesn't always work out as it should, given some of the complexities as has been identified with regard to these intersections.
Hey, great. Thanks so much, Carl. I'm afraid we've kind of run out of time. I always worry about not getting enough questions. And once we get into this, the conversation just seems to flow on its own. And there were a couple of questions in the chat that came up from Danielle Pierre that were actually quite intriguing as well. And so maybe I'll leave those questions for the audience as well as the panelists to think about. But, thinking through about how we could be using this information at the local levels within our institutions. So how can we use some of the information that we're collecting around disaggregated data that would help inform interactions that we have with students? So for example, on a day-to-day basis, but also how we could focus on taking a strength-based approach in some of the analysis versus focusing on, kind of what we usually focus on is often is there's not enough or there's poor outcomes of a particular group. And whether there's ways that we can also look at who's thriving in the institution and why are they thriving and how are they thriving. Maybe their experiences are very different than the students who, say, for instance, are not being admitted to the university. So there's probably lots of other questions. We didn't really get to a big conversation around staff and the implications that self-identification has for staff and so forth. But I know that even at York University, that has come up a number of times as well. So I want to take a moment to say thank you to each of the panelists. Malinda, Jen, and Carl, we really appreciate your time here today and for sharing your thoughts and your expertise around this. I know we probably could have had a mini conference around this with a whole discussion around all these different aspects to data collection, disaggregation of data. And finally, also thank you to everyone here for attending. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the VP Equity People and Culture website, as well as there'll be a link on the President's Advisory Council on EDI. So with that, I wish you all a great day and hope to see you soon. Miigwech, merci, and thank you.
Thank you.
Miigwech, Sheila. Thank you. And thank you to everybody for all
Thank
their
you.
support in the work.
Thank you.
Good work, Sheila. Thanks so much. Goodbye.